The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a symbol of American industrial might and aerial determination, was designed for one grim purpose: to survive. 4 engines, 13 heavy machine guns, and a legendary reputation for bringing its crews home from the flak-torn skies of occupied Europe. But on a frozen afternoon in December 1943, over the bleak English countryside, one particular fortress faced a test its designers never imagined. Its landing gear, shattered by German cannon fire, was gone, retracted, useless. Trapped inside the shuddering, fuel-leaking fuselage were 10 young men. Their only path to salvation, a 2-ton metal belly sliding across concrete at 90 miles an hour. The mathematics of survival were brutal. The textbooks offered no solutions. For Lieutenant Harold Henri and his crew, it was over. They were already dead. They just hadn't stopped breathing yet. How do you land a 10-man bomber with no wheels? The answer lay not in a manual, but in the desperate, flickering memory of a pilot and a secret move, born not of training, but of sheer, unadulterated will to live. Our story begins not in crisis, but in the grim, routine machinery of the air war. The date is December 20th, 1943. The location: the 401st Bombardment Group, stationed at RAF Deanthorpe, England. The target: the notorious Focke-Wulf aircraft production plant at Bremen, Germany, a target so heavily defended, aircrews grimly referred to the approach as Flak Alley. In the cold dawn, Lieutenant Harold Henri, a 24-year-old pilot from Spokane, Washington, and his 9-man crew of the B-17F Darlin Darlene received their briefing. They were not aces, not a lead crew with dozens of missions. They were, in the cruel calculus of the 8th Air Force, replacements. This was only Henry's 5th mission. His co-pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Bud Bowers, was on his 3rd. The men: Navigator John Jack Wallace, Bombardier Frank Frenchy LaFontaine, Flight Engineer / Top Turret Gunner Sergeant Mike Kowalski, Radio Operator Sergeant Alan Doc Henderson, Ball Turret Gunner Sergeant Paul Pee Wee Miller, Waist Gunners Sergeants Joe Petrovsky and Henry Hank Jones, and Tail Gunner Sergeant Charlie Chip Collins, were a patchwork unit, still learning each other's whispers and fears. The strategic situation was dire. 1943 had seen the 8th Air Force's brutal introduction to the realities of unescorted daylight precision bombing. Loss rates of 20% per mission were not uncommon. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids earlier that year had been bloodbaths. While the P-51 Mustang with its long-range tanks was beginning to arrive, fighter coverage still ended at the German border. From there, the B-17s flew alone into a hell of anti-aircraft artillery and swarming Luftwaffe interceptors. The mission profile was simple: climb into formation, hold position through chaos, drop bombs on the leader's signal, and hope to God you had enough fuel and intact aircraft to make it home. For Henry's crew, the hope was fragile. Darlin Darlene was their home, a fortress of aluminum and hope. They did not know that before the day was over, they would have to save her, and she would have to save them, in a way no one had ever attempted. The formation crossed the North Sea, a vast armada of over 400 bombers, their contrails painting icy streaks across the stratosphere. Inside Darlin Darlene, the temperature plunged to 40 below zero. Men breathed through oxygen masks, their words crackling in the interphone. The first indication of the ordeal to come was not visual, but auditory. A distant, soft thump, thump, thump that grew into a terrifying, percussive roar. Flak, black, oily smudges of high explosives erupted around the formation, each one capable of shredding aluminum and flesh. The bomber shuddered as shrapnel pinged against its skin. "Just keep it steady, Hank," co-pilot Bud Bowers muttered. eyes scanning the instruments. Then, at 12:45 hours, just minutes from the initial point for the bomb run, the fighters came. A mixed gaggle of Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s fell on the formation like wolves. The air filled with the crisscrossing tracers of 50 caliber machine guns and the brighter, faster streaks of German 20mm cannon fire. In the ball turret, Pee Wee Miller spun his glass cage, firing short, controlled bursts at a blur of passing wings. In the tail, Chip Collins' voice was a steady, tense monotone on the interphone. Fighter, 3 o'clock high, braking left. The noise was deafening. The roar of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines, the chatter of their own guns, the scream of diving fighters. It was during this melee that disaster struck. A lone FW-190, having made a head-on pass, rolled and came back from slightly below. Its pilot, an experienced hand, aimed not for the engines, but for the bomber's vulnerable underside. A 2-second burst from its cannons walked straight up into the B-17's belly. The sound inside was a catastrophic bang-whump, followed by the scream of tearing metal. Darlin Darlene lurched violently. In the cockpit, warning lights blinked to life. Number 3 engine losing oil pressure. Feathered. Kowalski yelled from the top turret. But the more critical damage was hidden. The cannon shells had torn into the bomb bay area. And, crucially, the forward wheel well. The hydraulic lines, snaking through that space, were severed, spraying fluid into the slipstream. The landing gear mechanism was mangled. By 13:15 hours, the bombs were away over Bremen, and Henry wrestled the faltering fortress into a wide, banking turn for home. The formation tightened, seeking mutual protection. For an hour, they limped across the North Sea, losing altitude slowly. It was only when they broke through the cloud layer and sighted the green patchwork of England that Henry gave the order they'd been dreading. Kowalski, cycle the landing gear. Let's get the wheels down. The flight engineer hit the switch. A grinding, tortured shriek echoed through the airframe, followed by a series of loud, metallic clunks. The indicator lights for the main landing gear remained stubbornly red. Nothing on the mains, Skipper, Kowalski reported, his voice tight. The nose gear is down and locked. But the mains, they're not moving. Hydraulic pressure is 0. A cold fear, sharper than the ambient cold, gripped the cockpit. Henry ordered Bowers to try the manual emergency crank system. For 15 agonizing minutes, Bowers and Kowalski took turns, muscles straining, sweat freezing on their brows, cranking the hand pump with desperate, furious energy. The gear did not budge. It was jammed, likely by the twisted metal of its own housing. They were flying a 28-ton aircraft with only its fragile nose wheel to land on. Standard procedure was grim. Bail out over friendly territory and let the bomber crash. But the weather had closed in. A thick, freezing fog blanketed East Anglia. Visibility was less than a quarter mile. Bailing out 10 men into fog over unknown terrain, with the risk of dispersal, injury, or drowning in a frozen fen, was a deadly lottery. Furthermore, Darlin Darlene, though wounded, still flew. Henry made the decision. "We're bringing her home," he said over the interphone. "Everyone, battle stations for landing. Prepare for a belly landing." The tension in the fuselage was palpable. The crew began frantic preparations. They jettisoned everything they could. Ammunition, the heavy ball turret, any loose equipment. They secured their parachutes as cushions. Waist gunners Petrovsky and Jones used emergency axes to chop away the already damaged waist gun mounts to prevent them from shearing off and piercing the fuel tanks on impact. Navigator Jack Wallace plotted a course for the nearest long runway, RAF Manston, on the Kent coast, an emergency field with a specially long runway and a famed crash crew on constant alert. The message was sent in the clear. Mayday, mayday. This is Darlin Darlene, main gear inoperative, requesting emergency landing at Manston, belly landing. The response was immediate and somber. Roger, Darlin Darlene, you are cleared for runway 25. Crash and fire teams are standing by. Good luck. By 1500 hours, Darlin Darlene was in a slow, descending circuit over Manston. Through gaps in the fog, the crew could see the eerie sight of fire trucks and ambulances lining the runway, their lights flashing silently. The silence inside the plane was profound. The guns were empty, the engines throttled back. All they could hear was the wind whistling through the shrapnel holes and the pounding of their own hearts. Henry spoke to his men, his voice calm but layered with an immense weight. Listen up. We're going to keep the nose gear down as long as possible. When we hit, it's going to be loud, and it's going to be rough. Stay in your crash positions until we are absolutely stopped. No heroics. We get out fast, and we get out together. The crew braced themselves against bulkheads, in radio racks, anywhere away from direct contact with the skin of the plane. Ball turret gunner Pee Wee Miller, now crammed into the radio room with Doc Henderson, clutched a small crucifix. They made their final approach, flaps down, at a painfully slow 110 miles per hour. The runway stretched out before them, a gray ribbon in the mist. It looked impossibly narrow, impossibly hard. As the wheels-up landing procedure demanded, Henry and Bowers prepared to shut down the engines and feather the propellers just moments before impact to reduce fire risk. But as the altimeter unwound and the runway lights rushed towards them, a new, horrifying realization struck Henry. The nose gear was down. Standard belly landing procedure called for a perfectly level attitude, the entire underside of the fuselage meeting the ground simultaneously to distribute the shock. But with the nose wheel extended, Darlin Darlene would touch nose first. The physics were catastrophic. The moment the nose wheel hit concrete, it would likely collapse immediately or dig in. The bomber would then somersault end over end, cartwheeling down the runway at nearly 100 miles an hour, disintegrating into a fireball of fuel, ammunition, and screaming metal. It was not a landing. It was a prescribed death sentence for all on board. Bud, we can't leave the nose gear down, Henry said, his voice urgent. She'll flip. Bowers stared, wide-eyed. But the manual, the emergency procedure. The procedure is wrong for this, Henry snapped. If we leave it down, we're dead. If we try to retract it manually now, we don't have the time or the pressure. We're at 500 feet. For a few seconds, the cockpit was a chamber of pure crisis. The ground was coming up. The fire trucks were watching. 10 lives balanced on a decision that had no precedent. To land on the bomb bay and fuselage with the nose high was the textbook move. But the textbook assumed no gear was down. They had a single, stubborn wheel mocking them from the front. They had to get it up. But how? The hydraulic system was dead. The manual crank was useless for retraction. It was designed for extension only. Time was measured in heartbeats. Then, from the depths of memory, a fragment surfaced. Not from B-17 training, but from a conversation months ago, in the haze of a pub, with an old, battle-weary RAF pilot instructor. They'd been talking about unlikely survivals. The old pilot had mused, almost offhandedly, about a trick with a British aircraft that had a jammed leg. If you can't retract it, he'd said, sometimes you can unlock it. Let the air do the work. A good, solid negative G bump. Let the plane fall out from under it. If it's not locked down, it might just fold. It was a crazy, dangerous stunt. A negative G maneuver in a heavy, damaged bomber? It was the domain of fighter pilots, not fortress drivers. It risked overstressing the airframe, causing a wing to fail, or putting them into an uncontrollable dive. but it was the only secret move they had. "Bud, I'm going to try something," Henry said, his hands tightening on the yoke. "When I say, pull back with me hard, then push forward, hard and fast. We need to make her skip. We need to unlock that nose wheel." Bowers, trusting his pilot with his life, simply nodded. "Okay, Hank, I'm with you." Henry keyed the interphone. "All right, listen. This is going to get rough before the landing. Brace for a hard maneuver. Stay in position." Confusion and terror rippled through the crew. What could be rougher than the crash they were already expecting? At 300 feet, Henry made his move. Now, he and Bowers hauled back on the control yokes. The wounded B-17, already slow, shuddered as its nose pitched sharply up. The airspeed bled away alarmingly. They were on the verge of a stall. Then, before the stall warning could scream, Henry shouted, "Push." Together, they shoved the yokes forward with all their strength. The nose of Darlin Darlene dropped violently. For a terrifying 2 seconds, the aircraft went into a shallow, controlled dive. The sensation was of weightlessness. Loose debris that hadn't been secured floated in the cockpit. The crew and back were pressed against their restraints. It was a brutal, negative G bump, and in the nose wheel well, under the sudden upward force relative to the falling aircraft, the damaged but unlocked nose gear assembly found the freedom to move. With a shuddering clunk-clang that reverberated through the airframe, the nose gear collapsed upward into its well. The indicator light flickered and went out. They were now a true wheels-up aircraft, but they were out of altitude and out of time. The maneuver had cost them precious feet. The runway was now rushing up to meet them in a blur of gray. Henry barely had seconds to pull back once more, flaring the giant aircraft, trying to achieve that level attitude. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" Bowers screamed into the interphone. The last thing Henry saw was the concrete, wet and cold, filling his entire world. The impact was not a single event, but a symphony of destruction. At exactly 15:17 hours, the belly of Darlin Darlene met the runway of RAF Manston. The sound was a deafening, prolonged shriek of tortured aluminum grinding against concrete, a sound felt in the bones as much as heard by the ears. A colossal shower of orange and white sparks, like a monstrous firework, erupted from the port side and streamed past the windows, illuminating the foggy interior with a hellish glow. The aircraft was instantly enveloped in a cloud of its own disintegrating metal. The force was immense, slamming the crew forward against their restraints. In the cockpit, Henry and Bowers were thrown against their harnesses. The wind knocked from their lungs. For what seemed an eternity, but was only a few seconds, the world was noise, vibration, and the smell of scorched metal and dust. The bomber slid down the runway, completely level, a 50-foot-long plowshare cutting a deep, fiery gouge into the tarmac. The secret move had worked. The nose-high flip had been avoided, but the crisis was far from over. The slide was a new kind of terror. The fuel tanks, though mostly empty, still held volatile vapors. The sparks flying past could ignite them at any second. The ground loops of 50 caliber ammunition stored near the waist began to cook off in the intense heat of friction, firing bullets randomly inside the careening fuselage with terrifying pops and bangs. "We're on fire. I see fire back here," came a panic yell over the interphone. It was Waist Gunner Jones. Firemen in asbestos suits leapt from their vehicles, hosing down the sparking left wing root and the shredded belly with thick, white fire suppressant foam. They attacked the flames with a ruthless efficiency, smothering the danger before it could reach the fuel tanks. The slide was finally, mercifully, ending. The deafening screech diminished to a groan, then to a shuddering halt. Darlin Darlene sat silent, wreathed in steam and foam, a wrecked but intact tomb for 10 men who were, miraculously, still alive. The turning point, the moment survival shifted from chance to likelihood, was a combination of Henry's skill, the bomber's rugged construction, and the swift action of the Manston crash crews. Henry, fighting to keep the sliding wreck from veering off the runway and into the grass where it would certainly flip, used gentle, desperate applications of the ailerons and even the still spinning propellers of the two good engines to maintain directional control. It was an act of instinctive flying genius. Meanwhile, the B-17's structure held. The main wing spars, designed to take immense stress, did not fail. The belly took the punishment, sacrificing itself to save the crew compartment. And then, the cavalry charged. Even before the bomber had fully stopped sliding, the Royal Air Force and attached U.S. Army crash trucks were racing alongside it, matching its slowing speed. Out! Get out! Now! Henry yelled, fumbling with his harness buckle. The crew, shaken, bruised, and bleeding from flying debris, moved with adrenaline-fueled speed. The emergency exits were wrenched open. The smell of chemicals, smoke, and fear filled the air. One by one, they tumbled out onto the foam-slicked runway, collapsing onto the hard, beautiful, solid ground. A quick head count was done, voices shaky, but calling out names. Kowalski, here. Collins, here. Miller, here. I'm here. All 10 were accounted for. The worst injury was a broken arm suffered by Bombardier LaFontaine during the impact. They stood, supported by crash crewmen, watching as the foam teams continued to pour chemicals over their aircraft. Darlin Darlene was finished. Her back was broken, her belly torn open, her combat career over. But she had done her final, most important duty. She had brought them home. The aftermath was a blur of medical checks, debriefings, and hot, sweet tea provided by the RAF ground crews. The official report filed by the 401st Bomb Group was a dry, technical document that belied the drama. Aircraft 42 to 29,786 Darlin Darlene rendered Category E, total loss. Following wheels-up landing at RAF Manston, December 20th, 1943. After sustaining battle damage over Bremen, all crew members survived. But the story, of course, spread like wildfire through the bomber bases of East Anglia. The tale of Henry's negative G bump became legend. A secret move passed from pilot to pilot as a last-ditch, desperate option. For their actions, Lieutenant Harold Henri and Second Lieutenant Robert Bowers were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation specifically mentioned exceptional airmanship and presence of mind in extreme emergency. The enlisted crew members each received the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for completing the mission and surviving the ordeal. More importantly, they lived. Hank Henry would go on to complete his 25-mission tour. Most of his crew, reassigned to a new aircraft, would finish theirs as well, a statistical anomaly in the bloody year of 1943. Their survival was a testament to training, to the ruggedness of the B-17, and to a single, razor's edge decision made under unimaginable pressure. The significance of the event at Manston that day extends beyond one crew's survival. It became a case study. The U.S. Army Air Forces quietly analyzed the incident, and while they never officially endorsed Henry's unorthodox maneuver due to its extreme risk, knowledge of it permeated the pilot community. It represented the vital, human element in warfare, the ability to adapt, to innovate, and to reject a fatalistic adherence to procedure when circumstance demanded it. The Boeing B-17 was a machine, but it was flown by men. On December 20th, 1943, 10 men, led by a pilot who chose to think when all doctrine said to give up, cheated death. Darlin Darlene was scrapped, but her legacy was the lives she saved. Not once in the flak-filled skies over Germany, but finally on a foggy runway in England, in a shower of sparks, and a secret move that turned certain death into a second chance. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII-Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.